Our speaker for this afternoon's luncheon needs no introduction. He's known to each and every one of us. He's been very involved in the activities and programs of the Council since he has been the Commissioner of Education. He has been involved regularly in our fall conference. He has been a speaker regularly at our midwinter meetings. In addition, a number of us, as superintendents representing our regional areas, meet with the Commissioner 3 to 4 times a year as part of the Commissioner's Advisory Council. It is my privilege to introduce to you our speaker for this afternoon's luncheon, our Commissioner of Education, Gordon M. Ambach.
Thank you very kindly, John, and a good afternoon to you all. I say to my colleague, former colleague Sam Halpern, those noises that you heard when I was being introduced would sound like a series of grunts with chairs moving around here. I'm particularly pleased to be with you at this occasion in which you've been honoring members for their service to the organization, and I note particularly the honor that's just been extended, John, to Vivian Anderson. I say to those who have been honored, to Art Shedd and to George Port, to Bud, I add my own congratulations and recognition of your service. I can't help but saying to Bud, the next round has already started. And I know that he and others will be addressing the very same kind of issues that we've been working at together as we look at this next round in the executive budget. Scheduling for your session this year has indeed been put together with a week of extraordinarily dramatic events. The return of our hostages from Iran and all the special meaning that that had to those of us who serve in educational administration, with the recognition that Bill Keogh once again would be returned to freedom, one of our very own colleagues. The change in administration in Washington, not only in administration, but a change in the control of the Senate. Super Bowl last night. Celebration of the state budget. The beginning of the annual rain dance here in Albany. I know you have a new Saratoga sound system in this room, and I've got to say, of all the times that I've ever been in this, the one hangar from the Albany airport, which is on this side of the Northway, I noticed that the sound is great. You'll hear splashes from the pool. That's a part of the annual rain dance in Albany. You've been given much advice this morning from terrific people. I have a little more advice to add this noon, but I give it with this note of temperance. A student was asked to identify Socrates, and she replied he was a Greek philosopher who went about giving advice to people. And she added, they poisoned him. Your theme is coalitions. Coalitions at all 3 levels of government, local, state, and federal. And as you think about coalitions and the anxiety that brings to the several partners who must join in those coalitions, you might think about a short squib which is going around Washington these days with respect to putting together unlike partners. The mouse who was told to take a place in the stable beside the elephant. The mouse in great anxiety sitting on the straw saying to the elephant, I really don't have anything against you. I'm only worried that you might roll over while you're dreaming about something else. As we think about the kinds of coalitions or partnerships that need to be developed, we think about unevenness in clout, unevenness in status, but the importance of pulling together those who have a different perspective on different problems in order to realize the best of solutions. I'd like to comment this noon particularly on one aspect of coalitions. and to focus on the fact that in our coalitions, the purposes and the content of education, and not just the process of raising funds, must be at the center point. If we're successful with the first, the fundraising will follow. Building coalition means expanding direct participation, which in turn means developing confidence, which in turn means, we hope, increasing support through resources. A couple of footnotes at the local school district level, it seems to me, are very important to illustrate the great need for expanding those coalitions at the local district level. We have a smaller and smaller percentage of adults who have children in the schools. It's fallen from 59% to 26% over the past 10 years, and it's going to drop down to 21% in 1985. 1 out of 5 adults with a child who is in school. It seems to me that that's a very obvious point with respect to how we transmit the message of what's occurring in education. We know that there's a direct relationship between confidence levels in education and being a parent or having a child in school. Over the Gallup polls in the years, that confidence level has remained steady. The confidence, however, for those who do not have children in the schools is what has fluctuated. And so as one looks toward the future support and the realization that 4 of 5 voters won't have that direct contact, it becomes increasingly important to find ways to reach them. One other footnote on the perspective of local school budget coalitions. We checked on the margins of defeats of the budgets in the course of this last year. Of the 192 budgets in our state which are defeated, 54% of them went down by fewer than 150 votes. 3 districts had tie votes, which of course is a defeat. 6 other, the budgets would have passed if 2 voted differently. 30% of the budgets that were defeated would have passed if 25 or fewer voters had switched. Now, of course, it's important to know what the base would be. But I think the other important point to be made is that when you're talking about coalitions, you may be talking about adding that one more partner, at least an organizational partner, that can provide that small margin that makes a difference between passage and defeat. Now, over the years in New York, and I speak now particularly at the state level, the parts of the educational community have demonstrated a capacity for coalition through such organizations as the Educational Conference Board. And that coalition, of course, is particularly focused on the issues of finance and state aid for the public schools. Indeed, your meeting here at this time in Albany is in a way a complementary or a supplementary part of that kind of coalition building of the educational community that's taken place, with a direct focus on trying to bring 2 other partners into the coalition, the members of the legislature and the governor. There are other partners in the coalition, not only at the state level, but at local and at federal levels. And I'd like to refer very briefly to 3 particular groups. One of them is the religious leaders of our state. Let me give you 2 examples of building coalitions. One of them is reference to a statement that was issued just in November of this year by the 3 major faiths, representatives of those 3 major faiths here in New York. A ringing statement of religious institution leaders in support of public education. But that statement is just a start. to pick up with that at the local parish or temple or church level is what's important. Let me give you one other example. On the very difficult issue of racial integration, in the Rochester region, the support of an inter-district transfer plan, which for the first time in this country provided that there would be, in fact, a transfer of students going both from suburb to city and city to suburban districts for purposes of integration, was in fact happening. And why? In large part because the religious leaders and the different faiths in that area joining together with community leaders and educators made it possible. A second group, and you're going to hear a good bit more about this group this afternoon, the media and particularly media executives. May I note in this connection, just in February at the Regents' monthly meeting, once again the Regents will be meeting with some 25 to 30 of the leading media executives here in this state, the officers of the publishing associations, daily and weekly, the officers of the broadcasting associations, not to talk about what's in the state budget, but last year, as we did, to talk about testing. What can one measure through testing, and what does it tell the media about what's occurring in this area? And the subject this year, the connection between the educational system in New York and the economy of the state of New York. An attempt to try to convene in leadership and the media with the Board of Regents and those of us in the department to talk about those kinds of substantive issues, get to the purposes of education. And yet a third kind of partner in the coalition, the business, industry, and labor leaders. We know the importance of education to the economy of this state, and we're beginning to hear more and more about it. And I'm very pleased to note that in the governor's message this year, for the first time, there was a pickup of the kind of connections that we have been talking about for several years. And we know what the maintenance of a strong educational system means by way of what managers do when they decide where their plants are going to be located, whether they're going to be in New York or whether they're going to go elsewhere. And yet we also know that there's a tremendous amount of skepticism about whether education is in fact an expenditure which is basically supportive of business and industry or in fact is a drag on the economy. And we know that there are doubts about the effectiveness of training for employment. How does one dispel those kinds of doubts? By that kind of partnership through coalition, which offers the opportunity for a face-to-face discussion and for the working through, in a local and perhaps regional way, of particular problems. In our state, there are now 119 different business, industry, and education advisory councils throughout the state. They need to be strengthened, they need to be increased. But each one of us has a particular obligation to work with that special partnership, whether it be in those kinds of advisory councils, business organizations, commerce organizations, or otherwise. Educational results take time. They don't lend themselves to media hype or to immediate gratification through the media. There are no quick fixes for building confidence in education. And to build confidence in education, it is absolutely essential to build confidence in educators. It's very difficult for the public, especially those without having any children in the schools, to have a very keen sense of just what's happening in the educational system. But I'm sure you would agree they make up their minds, by and large, by their confidence in educators, in us. During the past few years, we've had a very strong statewide concentration on the building of foundation skills. We've been pressing competency testing issues, registration issues, resource allocation plan, other issues all focused on trying to strengthen what occurs in the schools in the foundation skills. And there certainly has been a result from this, as one can see by looking at the testing measures, and I think one can see that result beginning to translate, especially as you look at polls and begin to see certain registrations of an increase of confidence in the schools. There's no question but what we've got to continue on in this concentration of the core responsibility for the schools. But there clearly is so much more to be done. And I submit that to do it, we must find strengthened coalitions. One could illustrate in many different ways what's necessary by way of an increase in our mission, but let me do it quite dramatically by reading to you just a short portion of a report that was prepared by the State Department, a projection to the year 2000. If present trends continue, the world in 2000 will be more crowded, more polluted, less stable ecologically, and more vulnerable to disruption than the world we live in now. Serious stresses involving population, resources, and environment are clearly visible ahead. Despite greater material output, the world's people will be poorer in many ways than they are today. For hundreds of millions of the desperately poor, the outlook for food and other necessities of life will be no better. For many, it will be worse. Barring revolutionary advances in technology, life for most people on the earth will be more precarious in 2000 than it is now, unless the nations of the world act decisively to alter current trends. The world's population will grow from 4 billion in 75 to 6.35 billion in the year 2000. This is an increase of more than 50%. By 2000, the rate of growth will be faster. 100 million people added each year compared with 75 million in 1975. 90% of the growth will occur in the world's poorest countries. While the world food production will increase, the bulk of that increase will be in countries that already have a relatively high per capita food consumption. Meanwhile, per capita consumption in South Asia, the Middle East, and the less developed countries of Africa will scarcely improve or will actually decline below present inadequate levels. At the same time, real prices for food are expected to double. Arable land will increase only 4% by 2000. The projection is that during the 1990s, the world's oil production will approach geological estimates of maximum production capacity. 1/4 of the world depends on wood for fuel. The estimate is that the need for this fuel will exceed available supplies by about 25% in the year 2000. The projections are equally dismal for other finite fuel resources such as coal, oil, gas, oil shale, and the like, as well as for minerals and for water. Enough red. That is not a cheery scenario. I provided it for you solely for the reason of indicating that as we look at that scenario, and it may be wrong in certain respects, but I think we can all recognize that in most of the respects, it's probably all too accurate. We can puzzle among ourselves as to just what on earth we do in looking at that kind of scenario. The educational system and the educational process is not going to solve every one of those issues that's cited, but it is clearly our obligation to prepare ourselves and our children to deal with those issues as well as we possibly can. And perhaps more important, it's incumbent upon us to build the coalitions of educators and those other groups that I have mentioned to try together to address the kinds of issues that are sketched there for the year 2000. We have certain projects underway. There are many projects and efforts in the local school districts and at the federal level for this same purpose, of dealing with the matter of understanding our international circumstance, or of dealing with the issues of racial understanding and ethnic understanding and of justice, of dealing with the issues of employment or unemployment within our own society, particularly those among youth, and of dealing with the issues of economy, of the allocation of resources against the kind of scarcity that I have just been describing for the year 2000. That's the kind of thing which is on the agenda. That's the kind of substantive issue which, in my judgment, it is absolutely essential to be carrying before the coalitions we describe. It is nowhere near enough for us to be thinking about coalitions only when it's time to ask for help and ask for resources. They won't come together just on that basis. They will come together only on the basis that there's a genuine partnership in reaching out to try to solve those kinds of awesome issues which I've just been describing. The coalitions can bring us as educators together with other leaders. They will not in themselves be effective unless the result of that coming together is that the leaders in other aspects of our society believe that in fact we have our fingers on the right aspects of the agenda for the year 2000, and that beyond that we have a very genuine purpose in trying to draw them together with us in realizing our objectives toward the year 2000. I hope then, as you continue your discussions this afternoon and tomorrow, and look at very specific, detailed ways in which, at local, state, or federal levels, there may be a practical addition or change in the efforts that are made. Underpinning all of that, you keep in mind that it is this joining together on the substantive issues that is genuinely going to realize the theme of this conference of building coalitions for the support of public education. Thank you very kindly.